We have to realize that in a relationship with God, God adapts himself to us in that sense. Like none of us would be surprised if, we had a friend who was Mexican and he said, "Oh, God spoke to me in prayer yesterday," and he said something in Spanish, right? God adapts to his Spanish speaking, adapts to our English speaking. And I think he adapts also to our psychology.
On In Good Faith, we believe that all faith traditions have something to teach us about how God is working in the world and in our lives. So join us as we listen and learn. Today's episode is the final part of a mini-series on neurodiversity and spirituality. We'll get to hear from 3 guests, one of whom is a Catholic priest. And all these guests have been diagnosed with ASD, or Autism Spectrum Disorder. And they each have something to say on how autism impacts their spiritual life, the strengths they've found, and how they've come to know God in their own way. I'm really interested in this discussion because every faith that I know of talks about humans as creations of God. So we have a physical component, our bodies, and they often differ greatly from one another. And then we think of our brains, our physical brain, the mind that seems to be centered there, and whatever our spirit is. How are those all connected? With all the different challenges to our bodies, our brains, the ways we function and process our experiences, we really need to stop and consider what a spiritual life is like for a person who falls into what we call neurodivergency. And ultimately, I think we can learn from these people who we call neurodivergent as they share their spiritual experiences with us. We'll discuss with our guests how they were diagnosed, how that diagnosis impacted how they understood their relationship with God and their church community, and what strengths they have because of this neurodivergency. In our last 2 episodes in this mini-series, 274 and 275, we heard from 2 people who coach others, one with OCD and one with autism. While these interviews don't represent neurodiversity as a whole, we are grateful to hear from our guests about their personal experiences. We'll start with David Gray Hammond, the author of The New Normal, Autistic Musings on the Threat of a Broken Society, as well as Unusual Medicine and essays on autistic experience and drug addiction. As well as being diagnosed with autism, David has ADHD and schizophrenia. He's actually going to share with us how difficult it was for his medical personnel to accept that his spiritual experiences were not merely symptoms of his schizophrenia.
I think in particular around being schizophrenic, I've had psychiatrists who will tell me that religious views are just part of my delusions and things like that, which has been incredibly harmful to me because, I do believe that spirituality is a fundamental basis on which many of us build our life and identity. But when you get these diagnoses later in life, it's like having the rug pulled out from underneath you. Everything that you knew about yourself suddenly is being filtered through a new and very different piece of information. And certainly for me, exploring the things that had happened to me in my life and understanding it through an autistic, ADHD, schizophrenic lens, I felt very persecuted at times. And it made me for a long time feel like there was nothing higher than humans and that humans were just really not very nice to people. So I lost faith for a long time, which was complicated because my mum's a vicar in the Church of England. I was raised in the church, but I had to go through this period of questioning everything I'd held to be true my entire life,
right,
in order to find my way back to some level of spirituality. And certainly, it's changed that spirituality for me. I'm not as dogmatic, let's say. There's an element of finding my own path through spirituality now, although I would say that there is definitely a sort of Christocentric idea around my own spirituality. But certainly, yes, when you get told after what feels like a lifetime that actually there's a reason why you're struggling, it opens up a lot of different thoughts, and it can definitely impact on things that you've held to be true up to that point.
David, I've already learned 2 or 3 important things from you. So thank you very much. As you grew up, you were taught about God, obviously, if your mother was a vicar, but did you believe in a God, or was that just theoretical to you? Or did you actually feel that you experienced God or the Spirit, whatever you might call that?
I definitely felt like I experienced God. I was very devout in my faith, and in the new faith I found now, I would say I still am devout. It's just different the way I look at these things. But for me, there were experiences I had in my life that I felt were fundamentally spiritual experiences that couldn't be explained away by everyday life. And for me, God was a very real presence around me. It was something that gave me hope and made me feel safe and gave me a reason to want to be a better person. And that was why it was so complicated when I had psychiatrists telling me that, perhaps this is part of your delusions, and those things that you feel were spiritual experiences were just made up by your mind. And it took me several years of self-exploration to realize that actually, whilst I can never definitively answer where those experiences came from, no one should be telling me that my experience is not real. I was attending, here in the UK, we have a place of pilgrimage called Walsingham, and I was even on the ministry team there, ministering to hundreds or even thousands of young people. We did laying on of hands, we did group prayer. It was a wonderful experience, and that was definitely somewhere in my younger years where I felt God, where I felt there was something beyond that which we could see, something tangible but above the world that we perceive with our eyes. For me, my spirituality, my belief in God comes from the realization that this entire universe is made of the same thing. I had studied a lot of physics, so we were talking about atoms, and it's realizing that we are made from atoms that were created in a star. The atoms in us are the same as the atoms in the wall, but for some reason we're conscious and have feelings and emotions and can interact with the world. And it occurred to me that if we're all made in God's image and we're all made of the same atoms as the universe, then to me, logically, God is the universe and we're made in his image because we are made from the same atoms that he is. And for me, that also made sense with how a God could be everywhere, because if God is the universe, then he is literally everywhere. And then there was also this other aspect of physics. You can't create or destroy energy. It can only move from one form to another. So the energy that creates the matter in our physical forms, it never leaves. All it does is rejoin the rest of the energy in the universe.
David Hammond's insights were eye-opening for me. I loved how his appreciation of the physical world fed his understanding of who God is in his life. I also felt very concerned that his spiritual experiences were framed as something to be cured, like they were part of his medical diagnosis. We have stereotypes in society about autistic people, that they don't experience much emotion, or they're hyper-focused on details, numbers, dates, or they don't know how to read social cues or form relationships. But one thing I heard from all of our guests was their profound emotional connection to God. In fact, our next guest will share how his Asperger's diagnosis actually created a spiritual redefinition for himself and pushed him further along his spiritual path. Father Matthew P. Schneider is a priest with the Legionnaires of Christ in Regnum Christi. He teaches at St. Patrick's in Cupertino, California, and he's the author of God Loves the Autistic Mind. He also posts often on his Twitter account, Father Matthew LC, that's Fr Matthew LC, where he maintains a large following.
So I grew up Catholic. My parents are both Catholic. All my siblings are Catholic. But I would say in my teenage years, I kind of went slightly wayward journey. I was kind of interested in a lot of different things and somewhat kind of making my own mishmash of different religious ideas from different faiths. So I was really not as strong as I might otherwise be in that my whole life. But then really, at the end of high school, my first years of college, I really had a deep experience. I really felt Jesus' love, so that was really, for me, it was like that age range, from between 16 and 19 I really started to feel like a strong draw of Jesus' love to me. And and that led me to join a religious community and become a priest and all those things. So my first year in ministry after I was ordained, they suggested maybe at the time they suggested Asperger's, which around that time, because this was 2014, Asperger's and autism were being combined. People didn't know that, and that was kind of tough that first thing. And so a little later on, in 2015, 2016, I got a diagnosis after I was already ordained. And that was really frustrated with God and frustrated with like how he led me this way. And even like I was saying, that first moments after diagnosis, I'm kind of frustrated. Why did you do this, God? And then afterwards, it came to that appreciation. And so that's kind of my story. I kind of realized when I was diagnosed how I always headed and how some things like back to my past made more sense after I was diagnosed with autism. But I was only diagnosed about 2 years after I was ordained.
But it seemed to make sense to you.
It did. Once it took me a bit. I would say the first few hours or few days, I was kind of like I was really fighting it. But then as I started reading up, I started realizing, okay, yeah, this totally describes me, and it describes issues that I've had that I just thought were like issues, or it describes things where I'm like, oh, doesn't everybody think like that? And then I talked to a few other people in my community, and they're like, no, like nobody thinks like that. I'm like, oh. So I'm really realizing, hey, this really describes me, from that reading, really. So I would say within a few weeks of being of the diagnosis, I really realized it was the right diagnosis for me.
An ASD diagnosis is not one size fits all. Some people may be extremely introverted, while others very extroverted. Some on this spectrum have very rigid thinking patterns, others anything goes thinking. Some are sensitive to external stimuli, while others hardly seem to notice the outside world. In other words, each person is different. Late diagnosis is not an uncommon experience, and it's one shared by David Derbyshire. David is part of Inclusive Gathering Birmingham's Neurodiversity and runs monthly neurodiverse spirituality sections. He's the founder of Asperger's Heroes, CIC, coaching adults on the autistic spectrum, and recently completed a master's in spirituality, including a dissertation on the spirituality of autism. David Derbyshire sees his Asperger's as a benefit to his spiritual life, that his brain and perspective actually help him grow close to the divine.
I wanted to find out what life was all about, so I went on my own journey, which was very deliberate. No one told me about things. Nobody persuaded me or tried to convert me. I just searched myself for a truth. I came upon a little Pentecostal church. I had an experience that I would call baptism in the Spirit and speaking in tongues. But I'd come at it from very much my own initiative and wanting to know what was the purpose. Maybe I was the only person that had asked this question. I had no idea. I just was searching. And that's what I found. And then over the years, I've reevaluated that every step of the way, I would say. And I think that's part of my neurodiversity, that I don't just accept what I'm told. I'm not just one of the flock that follows a particular guru or teacher. I think independently and question things. I think doubt is an important part of faith. That's what I've come to realize. I think that is a big step in realizing that doubt is very similar to another word, which is discernment. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to have doubts. It's important to wonder, is this right? Even to the extent, I think, of saying, hold on a minute, are these experiences really what I think they are? Are these experiences of God really God? Is it just me firing cells in my brain and experiencing something in that biochemical way. And I think they're important things to think and to wonder.
So in this search, I'm curious, were you turning to scripture? Were you turning to prayer? Or what things made you feel like, yes, there is a connection, there is a divine, there is a God, that type of thing? Obviously, this experience that you just shared with me.
Yeah, there was a spiritual experience that I call baptism in the Spirit. I had been reading the New Testament. So yes, it was scripture. And nobody told me I was supposed to read a little bit at a time and have a little sort of devotional time. Nobody told me that. So I read it like a novel. And, I'd read big sections whenever I wanted to. And I think also there was, lots of other things that I'd read from various backgrounds and various religions and spirituality that I was interested in. So it wasn't just one form of spirituality that I initially was gravitating towards. With the Pentecostal church, I think there's a tendency to then focus and refocus onto one thing. And so for a long time, I grew to think similar to that church and then other churches as I've rethought what I believe.
You're listening to In Good Faith. We'll be right back. I'm Stephen Cap Perry, host of In Good Faith. We have another podcast in our BYU radio family of podcasts. It's called The Appleseed. It's a way to take a journey anytime you would like, with stories, nationally known storytellers telling everything from folk tales and fairy tales, personal stories, and family tales. It's a great way to get everybody laughing or thinking about some particular topic, and it almost always leads to conversations in the family. If you hit pause after a story and say, "What did you think about that?" And boy, what does that remind you of? That is a fun time to get to share each other's stories, and that's what The Appleseed does. Check out the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back to In Good Faith. We're speaking with 3 different guests today about neurodiversity and spirituality. We've heard a lot about receiving an autism diagnosis and how it impacted these men's personal journeys toward God. But how does neurodiversity affect day-to-day spirituality? That was one question I was excited to ask in these interviews.
I can never tell if what I'm experiencing is exactly the same or different to what someone else is experiencing. The soul is both mind and spirit and body. And so I would say our whole being is different because our brain is wired differently. Our brain is that interface between the mind and the body, but there must be a spiritual element in all of that. So I think because we think differently and perceive the world differently, we're going to experience spirituality in a different perspective, shall we say.
I also asked Father Matthew his thoughts on the subject. He's going to share how the logical side of his brain combined with the emotional to help him find God.
I would say, really, when I first started having those experiences, a lot of books of kind of philosophical apologetics, like Proofs for the Existence of God and things like that, the kind of logical side here, were really helpful for me to understand things and really helped me draw deeper into my faith. But I would say in the deeper experiences, there's also emotion. I go into prayer and it's not just listing off of a logical proofs. No, there's a relationship with God as a person, and any relationship between person and person, there's going to be emotions involved. How I describe it, we have to realize that in a relationship with God, God adapts himself to us in that sense. Like he became man, but he also adapts to each person. Like none of us would be surprised if we had a friend who was Mexican and he said, "Oh, God spoke to me in prayer yesterday," and he said something in Spanish, right? Because God adapts to his Spanish speaking, adapts to our English speaking. And I think he adapts also to our psychology. So he speaks to us in an autistic way if we are autistic, so we can better grasp it. Because I do think we as autistics experience those emotional aspects differently. It's not that we don't experience them, it's that we experience them in a different manner than other people.
So with these differences, I wanted to know what our guests have experienced personally, whether they're sitting in church, saying a prayer, or engaging with their fellow churchgoers. So I talked again with Father Matthew to learn about his experience.
One of the things reading the Psalms say, "Be still and know that I am God." And know for myself, when I was a kid, you got that idea, and I would be standing there like perfectly in prayer, and like I'd be all distracted about keeping my posture, and I'd lose the sense of God. But the idea is, you want to be doing in a way that frees your mind to be still. And for us autistics, I know for myself, a lot of times my mind's much stiller if I'm rocking back and forth in a rocking chair than if I'm trying to keep a like super strict posture. And to realize, because we'll tend to take things literally, to realize like that's what it means in the Psalms. It means like, hey, let's have our mind still. And if rocking back and forth makes your mind more still than like holding a perfect posture, kneeling, that's going to be the way you can pray in that sense.
Well, that's a beautiful example of helping us understand maybe literal thinking and also understanding that the scripture is that's a metaphor and to not get hung up on. I was in a classroom recently here at the university, and I thought something's different in this classroom. And suddenly I noticed that 5 of the desks, instead of having the little writing pad coming from the right side, 5 of them came from the left for the left-handed people to use. And it just struck me, wow, how long have we been asking left-handed people to lean over and write on the right-handed desks? And here were some ways that we actually could physically make a change in the world to fit them. Are there changes you've seen like that for autism that have been made in your community?
For us, religious community has 2 senses. So I live as a religious, think of like a Jesuit, Franciscan, Benedictine, where we live. So in the house I live in, there's 8 priests, 8 of us priests. I'm one of 8. And so in that local community, it's very good to be very clear. And so that if I misinterpret something because I take it too literally, all of them know and can just say, hey, like I meant that more metaphorically, right? And that's helpful in that regard.
So everyone has needs to be met. Just like the experience I had with the left-handed chairs, sometimes it takes society a little bit to catch up with the individual experiences of each person. But sometimes it's hard to tell what one person might need compared to another.
I think it's useful to give some sort of gauge on how much support someone needs, but it is another spectrum, and I like the word spectrum, and it does vary a lot. And someone can not seem to need much support because they are a top manager, say, for example, and yet when they come home, they might collapse in a heap and not be able to do basic functions like make their tea or something like that very easily and need support in that way. So I think it can vary a lot, the level of support that we need.
In my interview with David Hammond, I heard a personal comparison that he was able to make in regards to meeting people's needs.
I mean, for me, I love hearing an organ play, but another autistic person might find it far too loud or even painful to hear. So it's about understanding what a person needs. You know, for example, if you're a church that uses organs, you're not going to want to stop using the organ, but you could, for example, say, okay, well, this person really struggles with the noise of the organ, so let's get them a pair of noise cancelling headphones that will lower the volume for them and make it more manageable.
Nice.
It's about that collaborative problem solving, because there is no one who is going to have more expertise on an autistic person's needs than the autistic person themselves. And that applies for all neurodivergent people.
So what is it that might happen in a church setting? How easy or difficult is it to find a place where everyone can worship based on their needs?
Minority groups historically haven't always had the best experiences of organized religion in general. So I think a lot of neurodivergent people tend towards less organized religions. I know quite a lot of autistic churchgoers, and one of the challenges that all of us have faced is finding places where, let's say, our quirks are not viewed as a nuisance or a problem, because it's not, then that's not just a problem in the church. Wider society sees autistic embodiment across its range as something in need of fixing. And so one of the things that's really important for me is, obviously, like I said, my mother's a vicar, and in her church, it's understood that, people are different. Everyone's different. There's 8 billion different people on this planet. They were all created by God, and therefore it's not on us to try and fix them, because God wouldn't have made them broken in the first place. I think this gets more challenging when you meet people with higher support needs, people who perhaps can't mask their identity in the way that I can, because sometimes you get these competing needs, and everyone has needs, whether you're autistic, ADHD, neurotypical, everyone has needs. And I think one of the challenges can be when you have people with higher support needs, their needs can compete with the needs of other people, and that can lead to conflict. And that can be a challenge in the church environment, because it might upset the status quo. And we do get into a kind of, a swing of things where we're used to things going a certain way. And then, if you add people who have different needs, it can change the way we need to approach these situations. Now, that's not inherently bad. It's not inherently wrong. What it says is that, to me at least, faith communities, regardless of religion, they need to be dynamic. They need to be able to change based on the needs of the people accessing them. Because if the goal is to spread God's love, or, from a Christian perspective, or, whatever the goal is of any organized religion, then we need to be willing to make our spaces as accessible as possible so that they can come into that space and say, this is my community, this is my space, I feel safe here, and this is where I can have a place of peace and spirituality.
This discussion with David Gray Hammond also made me wonder, there are challenges associated with neurodiversity, but aren't there also strengths? So I asked him what kind of strengths he's experienced personally in his spirituality because of his neurodiversity.
Being autistic has given me a wide range of gifts. People often talk about having overwhelming sensory experiences, but what they don't always mention is that sometimes those are really beautiful sensory experiences, because I notice details in the world that other people don't see. I will notice things like the way that dew forms on spiders' webs in the garden, and I'll see it in crystal clear fashion. I will hear sounds that other people don't hear because my hearing is a lot more sensitive. I will see patterns in the world that make logical sense that others miss because their brain doesn't naturally look for those patterns. Being ADHD, people often see me as the person who is forgetful and distracted and struggles to stay organized, but it also makes me joyful. My son certainly likes it because, quite frankly, I can be as silly as the rest of them. And, when you've got a 2-year-old, that's great. There's lots of things that it's difficult to list them all, but there's two sides to being neurodivergent, because people always want to kind of put it into this binary of being either good or bad. It's neither of those things. It's neutral. There are things I love about it. There are things that really upset me about it. But being neurodivergent in itself is not inherently good or bad. It's what I was given. I do the best I can with it.
I love what David Gray Hammond had to say about the strengths he's experienced in his life, and I was curious to know more, so I asked the other David Derbyshire, what he thought about acknowledging strengths in others.
I think we've got to ask the question, well, did God make me like this? And if God made me like this, was there a purpose for that? I think that the New Testament story I would focus on would be in the writings of Paul. He uses an image of the body of Christ, And in that body of Christ is the community, is the church. And each member of the community is different in that picture. He talks about one person might be an eye, one person an ear or an arm or a leg. And in that image, we all have a value. Each one is made very differently. So there is a lot of neurodiversity in the church. And I think this is so important that we can think, or that people can be told, because they're neurodivergent, they're in some way lacking and in some way have deficits, rather than thinking, actually, we have some challenges and we have some strengths. In fact, if you look at neurodiversity across the board, introverts, extroverts, different personality types, we all have different challenges and we all have different strengths and different character strengths in that. And I think that is such an important way of approaching neurodiversity. To say because of your character, you need in some way to be changed, when actually there's some strengths in there, isn't that helpful? It's like saying, an extroverted person really needs healing of their extroversion because they dominate the conversation. And that's really a deficit that they have. And you can see immediately how it is a ridiculous thought, but that is the thinking that people have with neurodiversity, that because someone is divergent in that way, that they need some sort of healing. I think there's also issues, is a more controversial one, is about resurrection and what we believe about the future and the afterlife. Will we in some way be cured of our disabilities in the afterlife? I think if someone's, had an accident and lost a limb, I can understand that. They will be perfect. But if someone has a particular neurodivergence, that is a personality type. And that is our unique character. And so I don't believe that in any sort of afterlife we would cease to be that unique personality. I was autistic from birth. I will be autistic till I die. There is no cure of that because it's me. That autism is part of my unique character that will be there in an eternal existence forever, whatever that means to you.
I really love that description. In fact, I'm thinking of a lady that I heard speaking not too long ago who likes to sort of ask all the hard questions in church, and it gets people stirred up. And she said, in the body of Christ, I'm here to be the stomach acid. I wonder if you would think of people that you have coached or worked with who are on this spectrum of neurodiversity. What are some of the strengths that you see, both in life and perhaps even spiritual strengths?
In the masters that I did, one of the things that I looked at, what is sometimes called an asset-based approach, where we look at strengths. And I think in that I identified 3, there are a lot more. I think there can be an intensity of focus. Mm-hmm. We can be someone that focuses, particularly with autism, but it can happen with ADHD to some extent. Ironically, because often that's to do with distraction, but there can be times when we hyper-focus, and that hyper-focus can mean we're away in meditation, we're away in finding that, like a duck to water, as it were, in prayer, in meditation, in contemplation, in study, and that can mean that we can suddenly achieve quite a lot. So that's certainly one strength. I think another strength I've mentioned earlier that was certainly in me, and I've seen it in other people, is that independence. We're not people that are your typical sheep, to use that image. We will ask awkward questions, as you said, someone who asks the awkward question, because we think independently.
Mm-hmm.
and we are not frightened to think independently. Some people might think, oh, what would God think of me thinking that? No, I believe God made us as we are. And as we think independently, we're using that God-given strength. And as we question things and delve into things and take things apart and deconstruct what we think and what we believe about things without a fear of breaking the conformity, without a fear of disobeying authority. And that has been a key motivator, I think, on my spiritual journey, to think independently. Some people arrive at their convictions quite early on in life, and then they put themselves in that little box and they stay there, and they never question, and they daren't think outside the box. I think there's a neurodiverse strength in always wanting to push those boundaries. I'm going to say another strength that I've come across in autism, and this is quite an ironic one and a little bit controversial, in that we often think of autism as being a slowness in seeing someone else's viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, when we do see someone else's viewpoint, we can see it very strongly in general. And so we can have a great empathy, particularly empathy for other people on the margins. So it could be people that are different in the sense of being neurodivergent, or it could be people who are different in some other way, who are marginalized in some other way. We can feel that we have a great understanding with that person. Someone may have a deep, deep spiritual experience, and someone else that may seem very able in other ways might not have the same sort of understanding of spirituality. But other times they can communicate deep spiritual things that are useful for people. And someone who can do that should be listened to, even if sometimes they appear to have other characteristics that we would judge as not very spiritual. Who am I to judge?
Hi, I'm Stephen Cap Perry, host of In Good Faith. Nothing captivates me more than people setting out on an adventure, especially if it's a place I wish I could go to or a subject I wish I knew more about, but I don't live in the right place or I don't have the equipment or the expertise. I'm telling you about a podcast from our BYU Radio family of podcasts, an award-winning podcast called Constant Wonder. With host Marcus Smith, you'll be expanding your horizons on all kinds of discovery. It could be science, it could be art, history, and more. Do you need that feeling of awe and wonder in your life more? I do, and I love it when I see how to experience that by hearing the stories of people who are doing and exploring all of those things that are so interesting to me. Check out the podcast, Constant Wonder. Welcome back to In Good Faith. Today we're speaking with David Derbyshire, Father Matthew Schneider, and David Gray Hammond. Each of our guests had some really amazing things to say about neurodiversity and spirituality. But talking to me is obviously not the only thing they're doing with their time. As I asked them about the people they're helping in the community, I thought that maybe God really does have a purpose in our differences as humans.
A few months ago, a young man, probably he's not, he's still in his 30s, not quite a super young man anymore. John wanted to start a group called Autistic Catholics to really start evangelizing the Catholics who are autistic or people who are autistic and kind of on the edge of Catholicism. And he reached out to me to be on the board, and I ended up being elected the president of the board of the organization. And so what we're trying to do is we're starting out with some online groups for small groups, to have weekly small groups, but the ultimate goal would be to have in local areas, whether cities or individual churches, parishes, to have small groups among autistic individuals, so that we can really live their faith together and have that kind of experience of community together as autistic individuals, where we tend to relate better to each other than we might relate to non-autistic individuals.
Because you wrote a book and took the time to do that, a prayer guide, God Loves the Autistic Mind. What did you learn in the writing of that book? Or did that bring you closer to God?
I think it did. I think a lot of things as far as, like, I noticed I divided into two parts. And I think what I gained from it was different in the two parts. So when I was doing the systematic part, it required me to go out and do some academic research. I cite a few like doctoral theses or master's theses or journal articles that I would not have necessarily read had I not been writing the book. I went out and interviewed like 25, 30 autistic people and said, like, tell me about your experiences, and had a few questions of getting stories out of them about their experience with autistic prayer. And I think all that research helps to understand autistic prayer to help others and also to help myself, because obviously being an autistic person who's praying, I have things in my own life that are that way. So I think those type of things is definitely helpful. On the second half, where it's like those daily devotionals, I really use those a lot myself. I've probably gone through it. I've gone through it several times. I'm not going to try and count, but I've gone through it myself, at 52. So over a course of a month and a half, just doing those as my daily meditation every day. It's been helpful for me in that sense to even go back over my own writing and realize, hey, this is helping me to pray.
Tell me about the mission of the Legionnaires of Christ and Regnum Christi.
So the Legionnaires of Christ and Regnum Christi are two related organizations. So the Legionnaires of Christ are religious communities. It's not as clear for non-Catholics, but if you think of something like the Jesuits or the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Benedictines, so it's a bunch of people of the same sex. There's male and female religious communities who live together and who work together and pray together in some regard. So like the variation is very big. You have ones where it's like they're off in the middle of nowhere praying together. You have other ones that are more like mine, where we're working together and we're spreading the gospel together in a local area. So like my community, we have a retreat center right next door to us, and two of the people work at the retreat center. We have a school 15 minutes away, two people work there. I work at the seminary, things like that. But we live that common life. So we're living, in many ways like you'd have a family with a husband, wife, and their kids all coming together for dinner and things like that. And so that's really what the Legionnaires of Christ is. And one of the things we specialize in is forming people to be apostles, to serve the church, to serve Jesus, to bring the gospel to all people. And so in that, Regnum Christi is a lot of the lay people who really want to take on that mission with us are also involved. We ourselves are members, but also a lot of lay people join to Regnum Christi as well so that they are taking on that mission of spreading the gospel, of forming people in that regard and things like that. They end up doing a lot of things like small groups or a lot of spiritual direction. We tend to do it much more on kind of the personal scale, not on kind of like, hey, big preaching scale, if that makes sense. Not that we're opposed to that, it's just that tends to be the type of ministry that we tend to do more often.
I was so impressed at what Father Matthew has accomplished and the contributions he's made to his faith community, but he's not the only one of our guests who has dedicated themselves to their community. I also asked David Gray Hammond about the work he does. So now you do so much, both with your writing and training, working with the clinical commissioning groups. Do you feel like that's a calling as much as a vocation?
Absolutely. It does feel like a calling. It feels like something I'm meant to be doing. It feels like something that someone out there wants me to be doing, and I feel like I'm in the right place. This calling to help others took that pain and suffering and gave it a meaning beyond the pain that it caused. It gave me a reason. It gave me something good to use the bad for. So I was able to take those years of addiction, those years of psychosis, those years of not knowing where I belonged, and maybe help someone like me feel a little less alone in the world.
I love that phrase so much that I wrote it down. Quote, "It gave me something good to use the bad for." End quote. I was so interested to hear that he had felt called to this work, and so I asked the same question of David Derbyshire. I'm wondering, do you feel, because you formed an organization, you have a website where you help instruct and bring together a community, does this feel like a mission? Does this feel like something God gave you? Do you have that sense?
In a sense, yes. This is very interesting because I felt from an early age, I felt a sense of calling, a sense of what is this that I'm here to do? And as I work through my life, I realized that it was important for me to work on my character and understanding myself. And people said to me, you need to be patient, you need to wait in that. But ultimately, I think it's meant that what I thought was perhaps a calling to the church or a calling to religion really has turned out to be something quite different. I've come to realize that I think my calling is to help people fulfill their potential. And I think that is my potential being fulfilled. And so I have run, as you said, workshops talking about this on autism. I've coached people individually. I've been helping neurodiverse people make the goals they want to make, helping them form the routines they want to enable them to bridge the gap from where they are now to where they would like to be. So yes, I would see it in that way, in the sense of a calling, in the sense of a mission.
On In Good Faith, we're always looking to listen and learn from the faith of those around us. And to finish off a very enlightening series of interviews, I wanted to ask one more question about faith. Father Matthew mentioned, quote, Jesus loves us, and I love Jesus. And I wanted to know how he's experienced that in his life.
I think that there's a number of things where there's kind of like those experiences in prayer where you're drawn deep in prayer that's like, it's something that's well beyond speech. It's something where we can't really bring it into words. Where it's like, I was in prayer and I felt Jesus' dramatic love for me. I felt brought into heaven with him or something like that. And it's, when I say those, I know what prayer experiences they refer to, but they seem like such an adequate description of those experiences because those experiences are so much more than I can really express in the English language, despite having a pretty good grasp of this language.
David Gray Hammond gets the last word, adding some great spiritual insight to the discussion about who and how we include people of all sorts and types in our faith communities.
Jesus didn't come for the people who had it all together, who had perfect lives. He came for the people who were outcast, the people who were told they didn't belong, the people who were told they were sinners. And he didn't really differentiate between humans on the basis of their identity. They were all creations of his Father, and as a result, he loved them all equally. And if we want to do God's work, if we want to reach out to all people, then we have to create spaces where these people feel safe to come and experience God. And I think it's really important we don't gatekeep faith from people.
I am so grateful to have had the chance to learn about neurodiversity and spirituality. Some of this is new to me. This is new territory. And so pretend you're in second grade, somebody came and gave a presentation, and now you say, "What did we learn today, class?" I thought I'd bring in our senior producer, Heather Bigley, and this episode's editor and producer, Aaliyah Ebert, for this discussion. Aaliyah, I don't know about you, but a couple of personal stories came to my mind as we talked with these guests. How about for you?
In one of my past jobs, I had a coworker who had autism, and her strength was that she was very social, very energetic, just genuinely happy, sunshine. And the place that I worked involved about half of our time in front of people, like guests, and then the other half of our time kind of behind the scenes doing organizational stuff. And one of the challenges she experienced was it was just harder for her to do that organizational stuff behind the scenes, which unfortunately had to be done really quickly. And so it was frustrating for some of my coworkers, and they started avoiding her. They wouldn't like interact with her. They wouldn't help her. And so I was like, well, there's this challenge that we can help meet. And so every time she was in our like behind the scenes area and she was trying to do something quickly, I could just see she was super stressed all the time back there. So I would just go and help her out, leave whatever I was doing, go make sure she got her thing done, and then send her off to the front to go be awesome in the front with people again, which is not a strength I have, by the way. I'm not a people person, and we all have different challenges. So just because some look different than others doesn't mean we can't help meet them.
I was really struck by this phrase from Father Matthew Schneider that God adapts to us, that there is a way for most people that they can have a spiritual life. And I guess I just wasn't 100% sure how that worked with people. And obviously this is a wide spectrum, but I really loved knowing that these gentlemen we spoke to represent people who have found a connection to the divine, even though they are not neurotypical.
I have to say that this episode made me think a lot about the people around me who I know they're not necessarily on the autistic spectrum, but they are in some way neurodivergent. And for me, it's always the case that I meet somebody outside my circle who teaches me about people inside my circle. I don't know if other people are like this, but perhaps you're in a congregation and there's a neurodivergent child who might be deciding on baptism. And in your heart, you're like, well, should they? I don't know. It's none of your business, really, but you have opinions about it. And just thinking about that and thinking, oh, I shouldn't be gatekeeping.
Heather, wait. You're forgetting this question.
Yes.
What about if it disturbs all the other people who are calmly enjoying the class?
That's a hard one. I will be honest, I taught for many years, and it can be a real challenge on the teacher to accommodate someone when there's 30 other someones. And you're not just accommodating one person, you're actually accommodating all 30 of them and all of their different things. I think we need so much more support for all of our teaching situations. So I think, Steve, you were mentioning in your primary children.
I play the piano for the kids in church when they're doing their singing time and everything. And we do have a child who is on this spectrum and neurodivergent. Very excited to be there, very excited to get the chance to hold up a poster to help everyone learn the song. But actually, it's kind of hard to see the poster because he's so excited that he's wildly waving his arms around. One thing that really made me happy is someone has been assigned from the congregation to sit with him, like his own personal support person. And they've been taught by the parents, if this happens, this might calm him down. Or if this happens, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, and I think congregation or family by family, it's different. Some family members might actually want to be that person. Some family members might want to know that the whole congregation is supporting them by having someone else do it.
Yeah, and maybe they need a break so they can actually worship and not be in caregiver mode. Boy, our guests taught us so much about having a spiritual life that I think it's opened my eyes to just the variety of ways God can speak to us. This episode was produced by Aaliyah Ebert. Our production team also includes Heather Bigley, Katarina Martinic, Soraya Pearson, and James Sturdivant. Our post-production team includes DJ Cromarty and Mark Hansen. Spread the word about In Good Faith by leaving a comment and subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. We think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. Find us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Our YouTube page is youtube.com/in-good-faith. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you join us again soon, right here in Good Faith.